So you might be looking at the title and asking, what do you mean by heart and soul? Well, it's kind of simple, I'll explain it to you here. So by heart, think of it kind of like a shell. So on the outside you have the shell, or the heart, and on the inside you have the soul, or the core. This core gives the game its uniqueness, its personality, its flavor, whatever you want to call it. It brings it to life, if you want to put it that way. Without the soul, the game is kind of monotonous. It's bland, maybe a little boring, and sometimes just plain. It's probably the same as something you've already played before. So do I think Soul Hackers 2 is all heart and no soul? Not really, but I think there are a lot of reasons for why I feel the way I do, especially about the narrative, and I'll get into that later in the video. For now, let's get started. The turn-based gameplay that I got to experience in Soul Hackers 2 was honestly a lot of fun. The focus seems to be on making things quick and snappy, hitting weaknesses to accumulate stacks for one giant attack, also called a Sabbath, at the end of your turn. For the most part, the game stays true to this. Many optional fights have damage checks and have turn limits, where if you fail, you get one-shotted by their fancy-pantsy almighty move. And ultimately, this is pretty fun. I don't have any major gripes with the gameplay loop, as they tend to keep weaknesses and resistances more relevant in the endgame than some of Atlus's other titles. Some of their older games devolve into a charge and concentrate fest. Additionally, you can power up your Sabbath with some demons that learn certain Sabbath skills. You can do increased damage, heal yourself, add status effects, or even steal items from your enemies. It's basically an extension to the all-out attack system existing in the Persona franchise. So I'd say the heart and soul are both intact in the combat loop. But outside of that, it kind of feels like the soul gets a little lost. Unlike Shin Megami Tensei 5, which focuses on exploring a large map with a lot of verticality and open areas, and Persona 5, which focuses on exploring a linear map with a lot of room for fancy and flashy maneuverability, Soul Hackers takes on a quite literally fully grounded, linear approach. I felt like I was constantly being reminded of another game. I couldn't quite put my finger on it until I looked up the director and saw he had also made Tokyo Mirage Sessions. However, I feel like Soul Hackers 2 is a lot more linear. There are so many narrow pathways. Every dungeon is like one big maze. And from the start, it feels like you walk so astonishingly slow that once you unlock the move speed boost skill, you aren't going to stop spending 5 MP for that every few seconds. It feels like the overall fluidity and speed of the combat is not carried over to the exploration. A lot of the areas are just the same visuals with slightly rearranged maps. This most often happens in the mid-game, where a lot of the areas are just abandoned subway lines. Aside from feeling repetitive to play, it's also repetitive to look at. Side missions also fall into this as well, as they devolve into fetch quests and kill quests. They're a bit more like homework, since you have to walk back to your client in order to report them. This didn't totally hamper my experience, as I completed probably about 75 to 80% of the side quests, but it definitely turned me off from doing them in the endgame. Visually, however, this game does a lot. It's a step beyond for Atlus's usual games. I talked a lot about it in more detail in my first impressions video, which you can view up there. But to sum it up, the 3D models are a lot better and they allow for more cinematic and dynamic shots because of this. The bust-ups can change mid-dialogue, which helps the flow of the dialogue in the game. And the towns are pretty decent looking overall. It's clear that a lot went into the visuals department outside of the dungeons. I think my biggest issue with this game is its overall narrative. It feels a little unfocused and pieced together, rather than a fully cohesive experience. While I was playing the game, I came across an interview, and I apologize if I butcher names. The interview was with Eiji Ishida and Mitsuru Hirata, the game's producer and directors, as well as Makoto Miyauchi, the scenario writer. Two of my biggest takeaways from this interview were from a few lines that I saw. When asked about the setting of Soul Hackers 2, Hirata said the character that underwent the most changes in the setting was Ringo, who was not initially the main character. When further pressed on the topic, he explained that she was an electronic fairy who accompanied the other characters through the quest. Ishida also talked about how originally she felt too similar to Nemissa, another character from the original Soul Hackers. So they went about changing her and other characters to match those changes. Miyauchi also says even after voice recording had begun, they were still making necessary changes to the scenario. At face value, this doesn't seem to change much, but even with this change, the game's story feels like it should have been told from another character's perspective, at least for a decent chunk of it. I think for most of the game's story, I felt like that another comrade should have been in that role. And I'm not totally privy to the details of when voiceover work is done for games in Japan, but if you're making changes to a scenario in the middle of that, it wouldn't surprise me if that's part of why the story feels so weird. To elaborate a little bit more on my thoughts, it's not that the plot is bad, but it also doesn't stand out. A lot of emotional moments require build-up, but the build-up of those emotional moments is done in the Soul Matrix, which is an optional dungeon. Without doing that part, the experience is definitely more half-baked. And while I can't totally fault the game for not making this a required part, it definitely felt frustrating that some of the pieces were behind some side content. Some moments even still feel rushed even with the Soul Matrix coming into play. But the only time I really felt anything towards the plot was during key moments where something big was happening. The smaller moments felt like they should have felt bigger, but wound up falling flat on their face. When I reached the end of the game, I was basically just whelmed. I was tired of exploring the same mazes, even more tired once they got to adding teleporter puzzles, and the side quests felt tedious, and finally I just got tired of exploring. It sounds like I absolutely hate this game, but I really don't. I liked it and I enjoyed the characters. I felt like they built a lot more on the characters after these major events happened, and it really helped push me along. It was certainly refreshing to have a speaking protagonist, and please Atlus, if you take anything from this experience, make more voiced protagonists. It really helps when you give them a little bit more of a greater personality, and it makes the narrative more interesting when they're their own character.
You ought to get out more.
If the main character remained silent for the whole game and barely had a sliver of personality to her, I definitely would have felt less compelled to complete this game. But ultimately, I did have fun. I just wasn't greatly impressed. It's funny because my initial reactions were pretty good, and I was having a lot of fun in the beginning. But by the end, I just kind of wanted it to be over. If I'm gonna put this game anywhere on my tier list, it's gonna go about right here. But what do you think of Soul Hackers 2? Did you enjoy it? Are you angry, frustrated, sad, disappointed, happy? Let me know down in the comments. As always, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more things ATLUS related, JRPG related, and anime style game related. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.